Herewith we present an almanac containing a variety of new, useful, and entertaining matter pleasing to men of all humors. Today, our guide is Charles Schwartz, photographer, illustrator, and biologist for the Missouri Conservation Commission.
For the past few weeks, I've been talking to you about the kind of wildlife we have living around here now. But I wondered if you have ever considered the kind of wildlife that we used to have here, and the kind of plants, let's say, the kind of things that lived here 200 million years ago. Now, if you have considered those things, you probably visioned a vast setting with all sorts of exotic creatures and actually unbelievable plants and animals, things that are practically impossible to comprehend. And in a sense, you're very correct. But in another way, you might be surprised if you were living or visiting one of those times and watched the animals you saw. You'd probably find that you were very familiar with a lot of them. Now, what I would like to do is show you a scene out of the past. These plants growing here, these thin jointed stems, are plants that grow here now, and yet they grew in this same country 150 million years ago. These things we call horsetails. That's at least what the schoolboys call them, and technically they're known as equisetum. Even the ferns that we have growing here grew here and flourished 150 million years ago. And this little fellow, which is familiar to all of us, is just as much a part of the scene today as he was then, many millions of years ago. This little turtle is a wonderful little creature. But, you know, if you looked at him real close up, you could probably see him just as a fantastic animal, just as strange as, let's say, a dinosaur. Look at this hooked beak of his, and this very reptile-like head, and these scaled legs with these sharp claws, and these bony plates on his undersurface and his top. Isn't he a fantastic little creature? Yet this turtle has persisted through time. He hasn't changed much in a couple of 100 million years. That's strange. And you probably wonder, well, how do I know this? Where am I getting my information from about these plants and this creature like this turtle? Well, now life in the past left a record of itself, the same as we humans leave a record of our own civilization and our own lives. We leave our bodies, our dead bodies, we leave our buildings and everything. And these animals did the same thing. Now, we have fossil remains of this animal life. And I've got a fossil remain of a turtle. This is an ancient thing. It's a reconstructed turtle shell. Parts of it are actually the fossil fragments of a creature that lived here, let's say, 100 million years ago. Now, there are other fossils too, besides this turtle shell. Look at these equisetum and then compare them, that is these modern ones, with this fossil here. This is a rock remain, a fossil remains of an ancient equisetum plant. And the biggest difference that we could see is the size between the modern one and this one. But look at the jointed stems. They're very similar. Now, I could even show you fossils of ferns. Now, animal life and plant life wasn't just one vast forest of equisetum plants and ferns and turtles, but there were many other kinds of creatures that lived here. And I've got fossil evidence of all of them, or of many of them, right here on this table. And what I want to do is tell you about them and show you how these animals lived and tell you something about them. Now look at this slab of limestone. This came from out here on one of our cliffs along one of our streams. If you examine it very closely, you notice that there are all sorts of fossilized remains of little creatures that once lived here when this was a vast ocean and when this limestone was formed. And these things were preserved as fossil records. These are crinoids, the remains of a little animal that lived in the bottom of the ocean. And this thing up here, this little fragment here, was a creature we called a brachiopod. Now I'm going to reconstruct those and draw them for you. Show you what these animals look like. The crinoid. And we even have records of them today. Look something like this. You'll probably think it was a plant, but actually it's an animal that had a series of tentacles with little branching appendages off of each one. And then it has sort of a basal structure and then a long stem like this, which was attached to the substratum on the ocean floor. And this stem was jointed like this. Had a series of joints all the way down to the base. Now, let me show you a fossil remain of one of these. This little thing here. You notice the jointed parts of this stem? And look at this base here, this part in this fossil. You can see the arms, see this basal part here, and then the beginning of the stem. Now there were other creatures. I mentioned a brachiopod before on this piece of limestone. Well, here's a brachiopod, a fossil brachiopod. This little animal also lived on the ocean floor, and he attached himself to rocks by a little stalk like this. This is a brachiopod shell, and he had a little stalk with which he attached himself to the rock. And a number of these brachiopods would perhaps live together. They were at times somewhat colonial. That's why we find so many of their remains together. I want to show you another animal that roamed our seas. But first of all, I'm going to show you a modern counterpart of this same creature. And here it is, this thing here. This animal is found in the southwestern Pacific. It's a nautilus. And in true life, it would look something like this. Here's its shell, like this. And then the animal's soft parts, the head actually, the eye, and the tentacles, like this, project out of this opening, which you see right here. Now, that animal can float on the surface of the ocean like this. And about 300 million years ago, one of its relatives looked like this. This big thing here, this big stone fossilized thing, which is a creature we call a cephalopod. And it looked about like this. So these things more or less jointed off. And that animal came up and had well-developed eyes and then tentacles. They came out like this, much like its modern counterpart. And this animal could float on the surface or attach itself also to the substratum. Now, here's another fossil, this thing. This belonged to a very huge, terrifying creature. That's the tooth out of a shark, an ancient shark that lived here millions of years ago. And a tooth that size must have come from an animal at least 30 or 40 feet long. A shark, probably like that, was a very fantastic and terrifying creature with its big rows of sharp teeth as it pursued other animals through these ancient oceans. Now the shark fed on things like the cephalopod and squids, like that. And it went after them through these ancient oceans. There was another animal that lived here that had a strange life. This little creature, this trilobite. Now trilobites grew from just an inch or so, or a fraction of an inch in length, to maybe 17 or 18 inches long. And they look something like this, usually a head region with pretty large eyes, and then a jointed body like this that had a series of little legs over here on each side, and sometimes projecting spines at the rear. And this animal propelled itself across the ocean floors and actually left tracks at times. Some of these tracks are preserved as fossil remains, and from those things like the tracks in these we learned something about this animal. But this trilobite did not persist. It lived here for many millions of years and then suddenly vanished. And we have no living trilobites today. Now there are all sorts of other animals whose fossil remains we find who once lived here. But the thing I want to point out is that where we had an ocean at one time, at another period in geologic history, we had a landmass because these oceans sometimes receded and then land masses projected themselves up. And climatic conditions changed so that the type of animal life varied considerably. Now look at this thing I have here. This is a part of a skull of an animal that lived under tropical conditions. This is a tapir skull. Now we have tapirs living today in tropical countries, and a tapir looks something like this. It's an animal with a very large, sort of a turned down snout. He has several toes on his hind feet, a couple up here on his forefeet. And the tapir is an animal that, say, lived with tropical vegetation, but We have them only in our tropics today, yet we find evidence of them even in our northern states. Now I've got the fossil remains of another animal. This thing here, look at this. That's part of the dental system of a big, vast animal that once plodded across our state. This is part of his dental system. Here's another part. Look at this. This came out of his mouth too. Part of his mouth, projected out of his mouth. I'm going to draw his picture and then let you see what he looked like. And you'll probably recognize him immediately. This is the way that fellow looked. This was a mastodon, a big elephant-like creature with his long tusks. These things here that projected out of his mouth and had a slight twist on them. And he lived here when climatic conditions were considerably different from what they are today. Now, the thing that interests me about all of this is this matter of change. I've been talking about such things as 1 million years, 100 million years, and 300 million years. And actually, those time sequences don't mean a lot to me. I can't comprehend them, and I doubt if you can either. But there have been all of these changes going on, and they're so subtle that you can hardly understand them, hardly comprehend them. Yet, even in our modern world today, there are changes that, while not geologic, we can still comprehend and understand. You know, in the span of white man's existence on this continent, a mere 350 years, we have wrought great changes to this land. We've devastated forests. We've changed the fertility of the soil. We've actually caused erosion of soil. We've straightened water courses. In a few years, we've built lakes, and we've even introduced all sorts of exotic creatures from all over the world, and we've caused these animals to change through selective breeding. And not only that, we've caused the extermination of many animal forms. The passenger pigeon, which once existed here in countless thousands, is gone. It's extinct, and it's just as extinct as this little animal I've got here, this trilobite that I drew a picture of before. Now, all of that sets me to thinking just about this change. The thing that is significant to me is that this world is not static, that it's always changing, and that change is inevitable. It will continue. And what I really would like to know, to my own satisfaction, is, well, just what is this world going to be like, say, a number of years from now? Say, supposing I were drawing pictures of the animals that lived here, let's say, 1,000 years from now, or even 1 million years from now. I know that a lot of those animals that I would draw would be considerably different from the kinds we have today. They'd be just as fantastic as dinosaurs. Yet, on the other hand, some of those creatures, I imagine, would be very much like the ones we have now. Things just like that turtle that we had up here. I imagine we'd have some that are very stable. Types of creatures that any schoolboy could go out in the woods and find today.